Welcome back to Voices of Justice, Then and Now. I'm Dakota.
And I'm Noel, and in this episode, Reckoning with the Present and Building the Future, we explore what it means to carry the weight of history while pushing for change in the here and now.
We're once again joined by the author of the Jim Crow North, whose book doesn't just reveal the past, it challenges us to shape the future.
As student hosts, we're asking, what does justice look like today, and how can young people like us be part of that journey?
Let's begin this important conversation. So tell me, why does telling the story of Pottstown so important to you, and how does it connect to what's happening to this country today?
So I think what sort of sparked my interest, there's sort of two components. So I'm from the Pottstown area, so I had an interest in local history. And then just from a professional standpoint, when I started to research for the book, it just sparked my interest getting into all the materials and seeing this narrative develop about the history of Pottstown and civil rights. I mean, the last chapter of my book, chapter 7, I talk about how a study of the civil rights in Pottstown can benefit those in the modern day. Just seeing how various organizations in town got together to address conditions in terms of civil rights. So I think particularly chapter 7 of the book really goes further into that in detail. It also draws comparison points. For example, I make a comparison of the Pottstown NAACP, its activism of the 1940s through the 1960s. And then I talk about more recently the local NAACP's involvement in local community activism and so forth. So there's also, I talk about in chapter 7, the Pottstown Area Health and Wellness Foundation's involvement in local civil rights initiatives and so forth. So these are important points to note.
What parallels do you see between the civil rights efforts you wrote about and today's movements for racial justice?
I think I've even just going to like the points regarding modern day Pottstown NAACP. You see similar activism and so forth. So I think the book can kind of shed light on that. And a lot of this is kind of, I talk about in chapter 7 of the book. So I think like a study of a place like Pottstown also too, because Pottstown's this smaller area between 1940 and 1970, I think there was maybe at the most 20 or no more than 27,000 residents. So it's a very small area, but even as such a small area, there was this involvement of the local community to address civil rights conditions. So I even make a point in chapter 7 that even smaller communities in the modern day, if they're interested in sort of promoting civil rights and so forth, they could study a place like this, like the Jim Crow North, the book, to gain further insight into how to address conditions. Also, I make the point in chapter 7, you see in the history of this book how local organizations come together to address conditions. So from the Pottstown Mercury, Fellowship House and Farm. So the farm was based in Fagleyville, Pennsylvania, right nearby Pottstown. Local church organizations like Second Baptist Church, Bethel AME. So we see how these local organizations came together, even in such a small place like Pottstown.
Mm-hmm. And during your research, was there a moment that shifted your thinking or made you feel this story had to be shared now?
I think just more so of my interest in history. I found it fascinating, the materials I was coming across on Pottstown and civil rights, and just always having an interest in history. It interested me, really the genesis in terms of getting into the materials goes back more than 10 years ago. So it just really sparked my interest of having an interest in local history in general. And I just found, interesting correlations of the local activism and even how it related to places outside of Pottstown during the time.
How has the Pottstown community responded to the book? Has it sparked new conversations?
I believe it has. There's been, so I know the Pottstown Mercury has done 2 extensive reviews of the book. I was able to, this past January, I spoke at the Hill School regarding the book. I spoke 2 times. The Pottstown Area Health and Wellness Foundation, I was able to collaborate as well. So I believe there's been a really good local response to the book. So I definitely, I think it's been in conversations locally, and I think that's just a great thing. And it's something that I feel is just going to continually build in terms of response to the book and even and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Your book really challenges the idea that racism is only a Southern issue. Why is it critical to confront that Northern innocence?
I think it shows because a lot of times we think of Jim Crow, we think of the South, and in probably the last 20, probably 25 years or so, there's been a lot of scholarship, books, articles that talk about Jim Crow outside the South. A lot of this really started. There was an edited book that came out in 2003 called Freedom North, Black Freedom Struggles Outside the South by political scientist Jean Theo Harris and historian Kamosi Woodard. And since then, there's been a wealth of scholarship, an abundance of scholarship that kind of talks about this idea of Jim Crow policies outside the South.
Do you think local institutions like schools or libraries have a role in how we remember or forget these stories?
I think especially, so let's even with this book, in terms of local schools and libraries, I think it'd be a good resource to have in terms of, and then there could even be curriculum built upon the book. Just so, a lot of times with even studying history, sometimes we think of history being somewhere far off, but I think a book like this shows that there was this history that was going on in the Pottstown area. So I think definitely the importance of local libraries and schools, and then even the ways in which such a book like this could spark further interest into local history and so forth.
What does the reckoning actually look like in a local context? And how can students be a part of it?
I think kind of something that I alluded to before. I think where we can study local history, one part I make in the last chapter of my book, I make the point that I hope that the book encourages others to start to look at places that we traditionally do not associate with, whether it's civil rights or any type of history, and then they start to do their own research and they start to wanting to know more about their communities and so forth. And I hope that further historical research can take place. I hope the book kind of inspires that.
If we wanted to start a youth-led history or justice project in our own town, where should we begin?
Well, I think a good way to start could be even to interviewing those who were perhaps alive during the time. So you could interview them and start to see what their perspectives are. And then even just getting into local historical societies, there's a wealth of historical information there. Start reading those documents. So these are ways that can springboard interest in history and so forth. So there's definitely a lot of local areas. There's a wealth of historical resources, whether it's talking directly to people or going to various historical societies or archives and researching the material.
Would you say that your book was made mainly or leading towards having an impact on young minds of today and the way that they think about our past?
So I think in terms of the book, I definitely just had an interest in kind of sharing the history. And I really do hope that it does just spark interest of whether it's local history or just history in general to those who read it. History can be a very fascinating study. I've always had an interest in history since I was younger, and it's been something that's just as time goes on, I've always had this continued interest. I do hope that it sort of sparks an interest in all who read the book and just showing even the importance of local history and so forth.
What gives you hope about young people and their ability to build a more just future?
Well, I mean, I think for younger people, just to continually find something that they have an interest in and start to research it and sort of, like I said, with history, I've always had an interest in history. So then it kind of led me down this path of research and ultimately. So I would say in terms of young people, just to kind of, find what they have an interest in and really kind of explore that interest, whatever it is their interest is. And that could be, especially I think of like even the educational route, whether it's going to college, finding the career path they're looking for, or say if they're, they want to start a business or whatever the case is. I just think you have to follow what you have that interest in and sort of then actualize that interest by putting in the time and effort to complete, whether it's a degree or whatever the case is.
Mm-hmm. And do you think your book was part of that change or that spark that led others, younger generations, to have more of a creative impact, to take what they learn and to put it forth into other lessons or to share stories from their own personal experiences?
I do hope that maybe the book can springboard their interest in another topic. Say, for example, if they are interested in modern day educational policy, well, then hopefully the book it gives them sort of a historical backdrop to the area. And maybe they have an interest in more, like I said, educational policy in the modern day or whatever the case is. So I do hope that the book can sort of spark an interest, not only this book, but then I hope it leads to other books. So, for example, at the end of a book like this, there's a notes section which goes over all the materials that were used. So they can be, say if someone has an interest in a particular topic, that can then lead them to further exploration of topics and so forth.
What sparked your interest in history?
I've always had an interest, probably since I was younger. I first got into history. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, really had me interested in history. And then from there, it just kind of built on various facets. So I focused on civil rights as a professional historian, but I've always then I have an interest in local history, just being from the Pottstown area. I think history is fascinating because the more you read about history, the more you just realize there's so much history. There's so many interesting cast of characters. And when you're able to get into to various documents and then to get a further sort of understanding of the time. So I've probably been really into history since probably elementary school. I wouldn't be surprised. And then it just kind of over time, I've always just had this interest in history.
Would you consider writing more books on any other topics involving history or more books as subtopics to this one around this particular subject?
So in terms of future projects, this book will probably be the last book in terms of like a main focus on civil rights. I'm still in the process now of I have a couple projects. One of them kind of goes back to 19th century Pottstown. So that's been kind of an interest. But yeah, so I'm hoping, in the future to kind of even since this book's been done, this might be sort of a last book in terms of like 20th century civil rights. But I could see possibly in the future of another book, but it might focus on another century. So like 19th century Pottstown or 19th century America.
Mm-hmm. And finally, how can storytelling, like your book and this podcast, help us move toward truth and change?
So I think it's always good to discuss not only historical topics, but I think podcasts are an excellent medium to convey information. We see in the modern time just how much the podcasts have grown. And that's a good thing. It's giving people to have discussions, to discuss topics. Various discussions are just a good thing, especially whether it's academic topics and so forth. It's a great way to convey information, to disseminate information. I actually, for the first podcast, for the Created for Greatness podcast, I've assigned that a few of my classes as an extra credit assignment for students where they will listen to the podcast and sort of provide a synopsis. So I think just the medium of a podcast is a very popular medium now that can be utilized, and it's being utilized in various ways. So I think that's a good thing to have, people are able to talk about various topics. I think too, it empowers people to whatever their interest is, they're able to use the medium of podcasts to build upon it. So I think it's a great way. It's a great educational tool or method, I could say.
That wraps up our episode on reckoning with the present and building the future.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you to our guest for showing us that history isn't just something we study, it's something we live and shape every day.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Washington, for coming on, for talking with us, and for sharing everything about your book, sharing more history that others may not know.
Thank you.
We hope you'll keep exploring the path to build a stronger tomorrow. See you next time on Voices of Justice, Then and Now.